Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hear some growling stomachs out there, so I'm not going to talk too long. I talked about smart contracts and blockchain applications in Dubai. So this will be a refresher of sorts. I don't think we have that up on the screen yet. There we go. All right. So again, we talked about this in Dubai, and this was meant to be a training day, so we're going to talk a little bit about smart contracts, and we're going to talk about some of the things that some of our earlier speakers talked about in the context of a smart contract. It's always difficult to speak on stage after George. You know, we have some similar Wall Street pedigrees, I think, backgrounds, and George brought Ned Ludd up and Paris Hilton and some other Hollywood types today. And I thought, how can I possibly compete with that? So I brought Michael Jordan to the party today. MJ, number 23. There's a lot of debate. Is MJ the greatest of all time, or is it LeBron James, or maybe Kobe? So Michael Jordan, when he signed with the Chicago Bulls, actually had a clause, a provision in his contract called the Love of the Game contract. And what this contract provision provided for, it allowed Michael Jordan to play basketball anywhere in the world at any time. He was allowed to scrimmage, he was allowed to play horse, he was allowed to play pickup games at college, North Carolina, et cetera, et cetera. Athletes, as many of us know, have these contract provisions which prohibit them from doing things like that. But MJ was such a tour de force, if you will, in the NBA and in sports around the world, that he negotiated this contract provision. It made Nike a lot of money as a result. So I would say that is a smart contract unto itself. Star Wars, where's Pin? Pinnicky's here somewhere. Yeah, so if you've ever been on a webinar with Pin, you'd see some Star Wars merchandise perhaps in the background. The gentleman there in the middle is George Lucas, the mastermind behind Star Wars. When George Lucas in the mid-70s was negotiating the contractual rights to Star Wars, he was just coming off the success of a movie in the US called American Graffiti. So he had some clout, he had some negotiating power with the studios. Mr. Lucas smartly said, you know what, I don't want any profits from these movies. I want three things. I want to have merchandising rights. This is long before there were any Star Wars toys in stores. He also wanted to retain rights to the musical compositions that John Williams composed, etc. And he also wanted to have the right to produce sequels. And as we know, this concept that he had in the early 70s went on to become a cinematic bonanza, and a few years ago he sold to Disney for an estimated $4 billion US. So I would argue that was a smart contract. And of course we're in Brazil. So Neymar, who I think it was 2013 or so, moved from, I think it was FC Santos here in Brazil, over to Barca. He had a provision in his contract that said, sure, I'll come play in Europe, but every 2 months, you Barcelona, you need to fly my friends and family on a private jet over to Spain or wherever I'm playing, and you need to pay for all of their food, all of their accommodation, all of their transportation. Another example of a smart contract. Here comes the mother of all segues. Nick Szabo, smart contracts, 1994. Computer scientist, cryptographer, lawyer. You don't actually hear those three professions in the same sentence. But he conceptualized the idea of a smart contract. He wanted to think about a way that technology could actually be deployed to actually achieve intended outcomes without human intervention. He wanted these outcomes to be self-fulfilling, self-regulating, even self-enforcing as much as possible. A lot of people to this day actually believe that Satoshi Nakamoto might actually be Nick Szabo. There's been a lot of intense debate and speculation on this point. Before the end of the previous year, I did 10 presentations in 10 days across Europe and the UK. And we actually had a quiz that we administered at these presentations. And one of the questions was, who invented Bitcoin? And one of the 4 multiple choice answers was Terry O'Hearn. You'd be surprised how many people actually think Terry Hearn is the mastermind behind Bitcoin and not Nick Szabo. I've never seen the two of them in the room at the same time. That's all I want to say. So smart contracts are general purpose computations that take place on a blockchain. So the outcomes are predetermined. In other words, what is intended to happen is actually hard-coded computationally onto a blockchain. So in mathematics or logic, we refer to this as a conditional statement, an if-then statement. He used a very rich analogy to talk about what a smart contract is. As I said in Dubai just a couple months ago, on the right, we're looking at a vending machine or a kiosk. Americans call that breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So in this example, with a vending machine, if you put in $1 and you press the button that says Doritos or B12, then Doritos will pop out. So in other words, if you do something, then the outcome is predetermined. That's the rich analogy that Nick Szabo actually talked about, first started talking about actually in 1994. So 4 basic attributes or characteristics of smart contracts: observability, verifiability, privity, and enforceability. Number 3 basically means privacy. Only the parties involved in the smart contract should be party to what's actually taking place. So some examples. If today's date is January 12th, 2018, then automatically send 1 Bitcoin to the president of Brazil. Or number 3, if more than 50 members agree to proceed with a proposal, then provide a digital signature on an agreement. This is becoming more commonplace in law around the world. Just this week, the state of Florida in the United States announced some provisions to actually render these types of digital signatures as legally binding agreements. So not only Florida, Delaware, and other places around the world are actually getting behind some of these things that are taking place on the blockchain. We'll probably hear some more today about DAS apps and some of the things that are coming down the road in 2018 and beyond. So the important point here is that smart contracts are not isolationists. They're not standalone. They, in fact, are very important building blocks for other smart contracts they integrate, and also for decentralized autonomous organizations. We've talked about this a couple times. Rhetorically, what happens if you have a digital wallet and you pass away? What happens to the assets, the ownership, the control of that digital wallet? So one of the smart contract concepts that is being worked on, it addresses succession rights. And again, the law around the world is starting to provide for different provisions to actually address this issue. We see it very commonly with Facebook and other aggregators of content and data. They actually have different tools that one can use to take over the content of a third party, a family member or a friend, if they happen to die. So we are starting to see these things come into place in other industries, and the idea of having a solution for succession rights is very important to cryptocurrencies, digital assets, and the blockchain space. If you look at the white paper, specifically pages 11, 12, and 13, it talks about the deep vault contract, which George just alluded to a few moments ago. So if you want to take some coin and put them in storage in exchange for a reward and some democracy, some incentivized voting rights, this is what we call the deep vault contract. So refer to that white paper and learn about how smart contracts are conceptualized in that regard. As far as some application use cases, we've been talking about it now for more than 1 year. Education. There are close to 2 billion people in this world who are in schools from preschool up through post-secondary graduate academic institutions. So there are 2 billion people who can actually benefit from data that becomes stored on a blockchain. Approximately 100 million of those people are specifically in colleges and universities. So we have the idea of storing records, academic transcripts, educational achievements, etc., on a blockchain. Land registration. We talked about this even last year, 1 year ago, I think this week, in Hong Kong when some of our colleagues from Uganda came up. There's a big challenge globally to actually hold title to real estate in a very safe manner. There's a lot of fraud that goes on. There's a lot of theft of property and real estate. And if these titles, if these deeds can actually be held on a blockchain, a lot of that fraud can be mitigated and can work very seamlessly with the registrars of real estate and other record keepers around the world. I think it was Pascal, when he spoke last night, he talked about something that was just announced, actually, here in Brazil. Brazil, of course, is a democracy. Brazil has about 208 million people, I believe. And here in Brazil, if there is a popular petition with signatures from at least 1% of the population, then an issue must be heard by the legislature here. So some leading thinkers and academics have thought about how they can deploy the Ethereum blockchain to actually store and process electoral votes. So smart contracts would necessarily be used in that process. And the electoral system would in fact become a de facto decentralized application. So not only that, they're saying, well, if we're going to allow people to use the blockchain to initiate certain electoral processes, why don't we render it possible for people to actually vote and engage with government from their mobile devices? And that's what one of the thought leaders on this process is talking about. A couple of the banks actually here in Brazil are also working on other smart contracts. They've actually introduced a way for smart contracts to play a role in initial public offerings, IPOs, not ICOs, but IPOs, the traditional conventional way of raising corporate capital through equity finance. So there are things that are actually taking place in this city, very interestingly, with smart contracts. And regarding smart contracts and the DAS ecosystem, a lot of people ask some of us regularly, when are we going to have the first smart contract? And I like to remind people that this has been thought out long ago. It's detailed in the white paper. And I think it was in Tokyo on September 30th when Terry was speaking about the DasPay initial coin offering that is slated for 2018. when tokens are issued against a cryptocurrency such as DasCoin, let's say this year, or Ether on the Ethereum network, that process necessarily involves a smart contract. So Terry, I, and Matthew, and others, we have held meetings with groups and organizations that are desirous of wanting to raise capital through ICOs and tokens. And there's a lot of great concepts out there. We've held some productive meetings in London and Dubai and elsewhere. So these are proof positive examples, and Terry elaborated on this today, but these are proof positive examples that the blockchain is supportive of smart contracts. And I'm personally very excited to see these things implemented in 2018. Obrigado.